What constitutes a good season in the Premier League? Well, it's all relative, of course. For Luton Town and Sheffield United this season, anything above 18th would be cause for an open-top bus parade through Bedfordshire or South Yorkshire. For Manchester City, anything other than first is an aberration, and failure to qualify for the Champions League might be sufficient to land you a show trial and the loss of one of your limbs in the UAE. For a lot of aspirational Premier League clubs, though, outside of the established rich six of the last 15 plus years, 9th place has almost become the benchmark of a really successful campaign. Breaking into the top 6 is so difficult given the financial disparities in the league, so a top half finish, nowhere near the relegation zone and within touching distance of qualifying for Europe, is like the ultimate status symbol of a well-run, ambitious, and upwardly mobile club. From there, having laid down that gauntlet to those more established clubs, they hope to keep on building and ultimately become one of those established clubs themselves. It's perfectly reasonable logic and a perfectly good cause for celebration. But it rarely works out like that. In fact, every single club that finished 9th in the Premier League between the 2008-09 and 2020-21 seasons, a period of 13 years, went on to be relegated, and typically not long after finishing 9th. It is an extraordinary statistic, which isn't remotely replicated if you look at the teams who finished either side of them, in 8th and 10th place, throughout that same period. So, naturally, I wanted to investigate, by taking a look at each of the clubs that have finished 9th, and where it all went wrong for them, if there is anything that they all have in common, and whether Brentford, who finished 9th in the Premier League last season, ought to be concerned. First and foremost, it is worth having a rundown of the 10 Premier League teams that have finished 9th between the 2008-09 and 2020-21 seasons, because that in of itself is quite interesting. They read West Ham United, Birmingham City, Aston Villa, Fulham, Swansea City, Stoke City, Bournemouth, Leicester City, Sheffield United, and Leeds United. Immediately, you might have sensed something of a theme. In all but the case of Aston Villa, and even there perhaps there is an argument to be had, the clubs in question were largely perceived as having overachieved in finishing 9th. Villa are also one of only 2 teams in that list, along with Fulham, who weren't relatively recent arrivals to the Premier League when they finished 9th. In other words, Aston Villa were the only club, pretty remarkably out of a sample size of 10 teams, who were regressing at the point in which they finished 9th. All of the others, to varying degrees it must be said, were in the ascendancy at the time. There was a feel-good factor around the club, and it was either one of or the best season that they had experienced in a number of years. In the case of Swansea, it was their highest league finish in over 30 years, and their second highest ever. For Stoke and Sheffield United, it was their highest in 39 years. They both finished higher in the same season, incidentally. For Birmingham City, it was their highest in over 50 years, and for Bournemouth, it was, and still remains, the highest league finish in the entire 124-year history of the club. West Ham's 9th place finish in the 2008-09 season was particularly interesting and impressive, given that off the pitch, it couldn't really have been a much more chaotic campaign for the club. Only 3 games into the season, manager Alan Kirbishley resigned, claiming that the club had sold Anton Ferdinand and George McCartney to Sunderland behind his back. Kirbishley, who had 17 years and almost 800 games of first-team management under his belt, though he has never worked as a manager since, was replaced by managerial novice Gianfranco Zola. Zola had never managed in first-team football ever before, and didn't even hold the required UEFA A coaching licence at the time. Kirbishley proceeded to successfully sue West Ham for constructive dismissal, owing to a clause in his contract which stipulated that he would have the final say on all transfers in and out of the club, and West Ham were forced to pay him £2.2 million in compensation. Perhaps, that's part of the reason why he has never worked again. If you thought that was chaotic, and it was, in late 2008, virtually Iceland's entire banking system collapsed. West Ham's owner at the time was the chairman and the largest shareholder of Iceland's second largest bank, which was declared bankrupt and nationalised in October 2008. Björgolfur Gudmundsson went from having a net worth of $1.1 billion in March 2008 to a net worth of $0 in December 2008, according to Forbes, and he soon declared personal bankruptcy, owing more than $750 million. Often cited as the world's biggest personal bankruptcy, as you can imagine, this wasn't great news for West Ham, though the club still spent a club record-breaking £9 million on Savio Nazareco in the January transfer window, who would go down as one of the worst Premier League signings of all time. West Ham also lost their top scorer from the previous season, Dean Ashton, to an ankle injury in only the fourth game of the season, which forced him to retire at the age of 26. To go through all of that then, in a single season, and still finish ninth, just 4 years after winning promotion from the Championship, that is quite some achievement. And following a summer takeover, there was excitement that perhaps now West Ham could really start to push on. The following season, West Ham finished 17th. The season after that, they finished bottom of the league and were relegated. As West Ham were busy finishing 17th, it was Birmingham City's turn to take on the 9th place curse, though you would do well to find a Blue Nose who was complaining about it at the time. Newly promoted to the Premier League that season, having been Championship runners-up the previous season, Birmingham City were hot favourites to go straight back down, heading into the campaign. Only Burnley, at 2-1 on, were shorter odds than Birmingham at 8-11, who came into the season with a 2-year corruption investigation into co-owner David Sullivan and managing director Karen Brady just having been dropped, and an ongoing takeover melodrama involving future owner Carson Young. Birmingham surprised everyone though, finishing 15 points above the drop in 9th and just 13 points behind Liverpool in the last European qualification place. Not since the 1950s had Birmingham City finished that high in the top flight of English football, so there was plenty of excitement around St Andrews, and going into the following season, 8 teams were shorter odds than Birmingham to go down, this time priced at 6-1. Second season syndrome can be brutal though, and despite winning the League Cup in the 2010-11 season, defeat on the final day of the season saw Alex McLeish's side drop into the bottom 3 for the first time in over 2 months. Birmingham are one of 3 newly promoted teams to finish 9th in their first season back in the top flight since the 2008-09 season, with the others being the very recent examples of Sheffield United and Leeds United. Sheffield United were the favourites to go down in the 2019-20 season, which came just 2 years after the club had been in League One, but the Blades, like Birmingham, took everyone by surprise. Chris Wilder's tactical ingenuity, with overlapping centre-backs in a 5-3-2 formation, caught a lot of teams off guard, and they might have qualified for the Champions League were it not for the fact that no one in their squad scored more than 6 goals. The Blades lost the same number of games that season as Chelsea, who finished 4th, and only 2 points separated them from Mikel Arteta's Arsenal. For a club that had spent most of the past decade playing in League One, this was a Herculean first season back in the big time, and Blades fans couldn't wait to see what was next. The answer, as they'd have known if they knew about the 9th place curse, was of course relegation, and an emphatic relegation at that. Having lost 12 games all season the previous term, Sheffield United lost 29 games in the 2020-21 season, the joint most in a single Premier League campaign, tied with Derby County, as they amassed a miserable 23 points and finished dead last. Leeds United won promotion from the Championship and finished 9th in the Premier League exactly 1 year after their Yorkshire rivals, but surely they wouldn't just be a flash in the pan as well. Leeds had won the Championship title, unlike Sheffield United. They had amassed a whopping 59 points in their first season back in the top flight, and they were managed by a man who Pep Guardiola described as the best coach in world football. The following season, Marcelo Bielsa was sacked, and although Leeds avoided relegation in a dramatic final day of the season, it only delayed the inevitable. Last season, Leeds finished 19th under their third manager of the season, having won just 7 games throughout the entire campaign. That's not even half as many as they won in 2020-21, when they finished 3 points behind Tottenham and only 2 behind Arsenal. Swansea City and Bournemouth, meanwhile, weren't quite newly promoted, but managed to finish 9th in only their second seasons in the Premier League. In some ways, that ought to be even more positive, since they had illustrated an ability to survive, first and foremost, and now they had built upon that with top-half finishes. This wasn't just one freak season. Swansea, for example, had already finished 11th in their first season of top-flight football in 3 decades under Brendan Rodgers, playing a vibrant brand of possession-based football that had won them promotion in the first place and had earned them massive plaudits. It also landed Rodgers the Liverpool job over the summer, but Swansea only improved without him, as Michael Laudrup guided the Swans not only to a League Cup crown at Wembley Stadium, which was Swansea's first ever major trophy, and with it came European football, but also a 9th place finish in the Premier League, only 2 places below Rodgers' Liverpool. In fairness to Swansea, the curse took a little longer to strike them down, relegated in 2018, having flirted with the drop for the past 3 seasons, but it gets everyone eventually. Bournemouth, similarly to Swansea, had climbed from League 2 to the Premier League in just 5 years, it took Swansea 6, and their style of play under Eddie Howe drew plaudits from all quarters and plenty of support from neutrals. You will need more than that to dodge the 9th place curse, though. 3 years was all that it took for the kiss of death to draw to its natural conclusion at Dean Court, with Eddie Howe departing at the end of the 2019-20 season by mutual consent. Leicester City and Stoke City, the only teams to have finished 9th more than once since 2008, did so in their 4th and 6th seasons back in the Premier League. Leicester's circumstances were a little bit, well, should we just say, unusual, having won the Premier League in the greatest upset in modern football history in 2016, 2 years before finishing 9th. In the intervening season, though, Claudio Ranieri had been sacked as the Foxes flirted with a drop, and the successive 9th place finishes which followed, under Claude Puel and then Brendan Rodgers, was seen as a sign of progress. And, unlike pretty much every other team to have finished 9th in the past 15 years, briefly at least, it was. Leicester finished 5th in consecutive seasons, following their successive 9th place finishes, even lifting an FA Cup in 2021, but the curse can only be resisted for so long. Sure enough, last season, the Foxes were relegated, despite having the highest wage bill outside of the rich 6. Stoke City three-peated finishing 9th, as the Americans would say, if you can three-peat finishing 9th, I'm not really sure, between 2013 and 2016, making the position their own. Never in any danger of relegation, but only once in any kind of European contention, Stoke's season, in any meaningful sense, was effectively over by March. Mark Hughes was the man responsible for all 3 of Stoke's 9th place finishes at the club, but a lot of Stoke fans feel that he also bears a great deal of responsibility for the club's rapid downfall over the next few years. Of course, he doesn't actually, it's just that once you finish 9th, you are doomed, and if you finish 9th thrice, well, you're never mind. It doesn't matter whether you've got Phil Neville or Pep Guardiola in charge, it's just game over. Stoke were relegated in 2018 and are yet to return to the Premier League. Aston Villa and Fulham's 9th place finishes were a little bit different. Fulham's, while creditable, came as no great shock like Birmingham City or Sheffield United's. They had been a mid-table team for the past 3 seasons and even reached the Europa League final in 2010. The following season, they finished mid-table once again, but in 2013-14, they collapsed harder and faster than Iceland's banking system in 2008. Some would say that losing Dimitar Berbatov and the disastrous appointments of Rene Meulenstein and Felix Magath were responsible for Fulham's collapse and relegation. But obviously, we know that it was just because they had finished 9th and had therefore been condemned by the gods. Villa, in contrast to everyone else, had finished 6th for 3 seasons on the bounce before falling to a 9th place finish in the 2010-11 season, as the Martin O'Neill era came to an end. For the next 4 years, Villa only narrowly avoided relegation, thanks largely to the goals of Christian Benteke, but in 2015-16, they were put out of their misery with one of the worst Premier League seasons of all time. At this point, just in the interest of full disclosure, I should probably come clean and admit that I don't believe in curses, or that by finishing 9th in the Premier League table, supernatural forces conspire to dictate that an imminent relegation is unavoidable. Apologies, I probably should have opened with that. I feel as though I've led you all on for all of this time. It is undeniably strange, though, that the fate of teams who finish 9th in the Premier League is so much worse than those who finish 8th, 10th, and even 11th over a long enough period. So what is going on? Well, a large factor, which is in of itself quite odd, is just that none of the big or rich 6 have finished 9th over the past 15 years. Manchester United have finished 7th and 6th thrice during that time. Manchester City finished 10th in their first season of Emirati ownership. Arsenal have finished 8th twice. Liverpool have finished 6th, 7th and 8th. Spurs have finished 7th and 8th twice. And Chelsea have finished as low as 10th and 12th, but never 9th. That is just a coincidence, or an anomaly if you like, which strengthens the 9th place curse's credentials, but there is something bigger going on here, I think. The Premier League has long had 6 clubs, soon to be, if not already 7 with the addition of Newcastle United, owned by the Saudi state, who can't get relegated. Even in the most catastrophic season imaginable, in which virtually everything that could go wrong does, as was pretty much the case at Chelsea last season, they still only finished 12th, 10 points clear of the drop, and it is unimaginable that they could be that bad again this season. Everyone else, though, regardless of how strong they might look in the present, is only ever 1 or 2 bad seasons away from relegation. Southampton, Leicester, Aston Villa, and a pre-Saudi era Newcastle United have all broken into not just the top half of the Premier League table, but the division's top 6 since 2008, being hailed as the model of how to compete with the elite, in all but probably Newcastle's case, but all 4, not long after that, had been relegated. That is the reality of English football. The worst 6, arguably now 7 teams, capable of competing for the biggest prizes on a consistent basis, and 13 others who could go down each season if they take their eye off the ball. The result is a fairly predictable and recurring cycle. Clubs recruit well, their form improves, and they finish in the top half, often 9th as it happens. Then they have 1 or 2 bad seasons, get relegated, receive huge parachute payments, are typically promoted again, begin to look up the table, and so the process starts all over again. Take Aston Villa, who I recently made a video about documenting their rise and recent recruitment. Villa are perfectly placed to have a brilliant season, and I suspect that they may well do just that. But we all know that they won't win the Premier League title, and if they don't recruit so well next summer, maybe someone comes and poaches Unai Emery, all of a sudden they are in big trouble once again. It might feel distant or unlikely now, with Villa looking in such healthy shape, but so did Wolves, Leicester, and West Ham just a few years ago. So what to make of Brentford, who finished 9th last season, and indeed Brighton, who finished 9th the season before that? Well, oddly, these are the 2 hardest teams to say with certainty what I just said about Villa, Leicester and Wolves. Similarly run by former business partners turned adversaries, both Brentford and Brighton's success owes not only to the wealth and emotional investment of their owners, but also their highly analytical and data-driven approaches to recruitment. Over the past decade, no 2 teams in English football have done better transfer business than Brentford and Brighton, who were League One rivals in the 2010-11 season. For that reason, because it is so methodical, one could make the case that they are better immunised against the 9th place curse, or just the orthodox cycle of English football, than just about anyone else. But that is still no guarantee. Brentford, for example, having lost Ivan Toney and almost certainly David Raya by the time this video comes out, will be without arguably their two best players from their 9th place finish last season at the start of this campaign. Do I think they'll get relegated? No, probably not, but it's hardly unthinkable. Even Brighton, who have strengthened yet again this summer following a superb season under Roberto De Zerbi, are almost entirely dependent upon their owner Tony Bloom. That is both their greatest strength, since he's just about the only person at the club who Chelsea don't seem able to buy, and, well, Liverpool I suppose, and it means that they can seemingly continue to improve indefinitely, despite repeatedly losing their best players. But it is also their biggest weakness when one imagines life after Bloom. Brighton are in over £300 million of debt. They are the 5th most indebted team in the Premier League, despite having significantly less revenue than all of the teams who are more indebted than them. Both financially and strategically, they are reliant upon one man. And as committed and capable as he may be, and the answer to those seems to be both at this moment in time, that's what separates them and everyone else from the Rich Six, and why I wouldn't even feel confident in predicting their fate over the next decade. That is my theory at least, as to why so many teams who have finished 9th over the last 15 years have soon met a pretty disastrous fate. Well, it's either that, or there really is a curse. Anyway, that is it for today's video. I found it interesting, so I hope that you did too. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts and your own theories if you have any down below in the comments. And of course, make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel and my second channel, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.